Right.
Let's go. Good evening, everyone. How you doing?
Good evening. Good evening.
Welcome to the land.
Good evening.
At CB11. My name is Jason Villanueva and I'm the chair of the committee. The meeting is called into order at 6:37 PM. Tonight, we are joined by Khalid, the staff liaison to our committee this evening. In order to conduct an efficient meeting, let's observe a few ground rules. No one may speak until granted the floor. CB11 members, if you have a question about board business or wish to make a motion, please raise your hand and wait to be recognized. Members should not engage in a back and forth discussion. The chair will recognize the next person to speak. The chat that's a part of the Zoom function should not be used for CB11 business or questions about agenda topics. All such remarks should be made on the record when recognized. Please keep your questions and comments brief and on topic to the discussion. Members of the public, if you have any questions or comments about the subject on the agenda, please raise your hand and wait to be recognized, whether it be in person or through Zoom. We will now take attendance by roll call.
Okay, members, for your information, there are 13 members on this committee, 7 are needed for quorum. Kenneth Crouch, present. You, Jessica Elliott. Arnis Foster Hernandez,
Present.
Pascal Hano. Jewel Jones. Sure, Jewel's here or not. Jessica Morris is absent.
President, I'm here, Kelly.
Nilsa Orama.
Present.
Thank you, Nilsa. Jessica Elliott. Perfect.
I didn't hear my name. Am I not on this anymore?
Oh, you are. I'm sorry, excuse me. Embry Hop. Like Embry Hop.
I'm here.
I'm sorry about that.
It's all right. Hopefully it was not a mistake.
That way to get the news.
Beverly Pavone,
Present.
Derek Stampone,
Present.
Vinnie Torres, Response Jason Villanueva,
Present.
and Candy Vivez Vasquez.
Present.
Who has a form?
This is awesome. Quorum is present. Excellent. So now we'll move on to adoption of the agenda. The agenda for tonight's meeting was distributed ahead of time by the board office and was posted online. If there's no objection, we will adopt the agenda as stated. Committee members, if you object to adopting the agenda, you may raise your hand to be recognized. Excellent. Seeing no objections, the agenda for tonight's meeting is adopted. Adoption of the meeting minutes. Ken, were you able to send them out last?
I have not, unfortunately, I owe
Okay.
you several sets, but I'll make
Oh,
sure.
this
it's on this
one,
week.
the month of December.
Okay.
So we'll push off that for next month. Excellent. And now announcements. Is there any announcements? From any of the board members? Well, Happy New Year. Welcome back.
Oh, I'll make an announcement.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can send it to everybody. We're doing some walkthroughs of the NYCHA properties in the next couple weekends. We have 3 walkthrough scheduled. I'll give the details out via email. The committee already has them. I don't like to start inviting everybody, but you know, you're all welcome to come.
What's the first one this Sunday?
Yeah, and then this one Sunday, and then next weekend, I think we have Saturday and Sunday. But I'll send, I think you've been on the email, but I'll send it to everybody. Maybe I'll send it to you.
I definitely think it's an effort for the showcase and the support. I know one of the questions I constantly have, that's probably not all sourced on housing, is like, what is NYCHA doing with private development? Like, I hear a lot of chatter, I even see it in the construction world. I don't know, right? And I know we have a lot of projects in this community, and if we get ahead of it, especially like, again, I see like Ascension, we have an example. They're a good partner, but I need not express my concern is maybe partners we're not familiar with, or maybe quote unquote bad apples.
Yeah, the packed rad stuff is what's going through private development, and the comptroller did a audit, and in that audit found out that the eviction rates in the packed rad, some of the properties was double the eviction rate throughout the city, period. And almost a lot higher than typical NYCHA eviction rates. And then a lot of it might be stemmed to the lack of, there's not a consistent outreach to let people know what would get them evicted, property to property.
Mhm.
And I don't know if that's NYCHA dropping the ball and not streamlining it, and then that's allowing, you know, whoever the different partners are to kind of play games with it. But there was one specific, group that has had particularly high, I don't remember off the top of my head, but we're actively pursuing that, and Ascendant is involved in some packed rad stuff, so we were gonna try to pick their brains about that too, so maybe I'll get more information on that.
Yeah, obviously, anything we can do to support.
Thank you.
You're not speaking for the members. We need to help housing, so that way it doesn't come back to our court later on.
I won't let that happen, don't worry. That's why I went there.
Excellent. So, any, other announcements from the powers that be? How about some informational updates? I have none right now, just, you know, we're streamlining for the new year. I am excited that we'll definitely be voting on our first landmark / preservation action today. Since I've been a board member and watching land use, I've never witnessed that. It doesn't mean it hasn't been done with previous chairs. I'm not saying that, but at least in our tenure, it's been a while. So to see that come into fruition as a discussion that was honestly spearheaded a year or two ago by Jessica Morris, to now see it Ken spearheading and leading that as the vice chair for us, and now getting to a stage where we can assist CEO. That said, we're not gonna have all the answers, right? But it's a process that we're developing, as opposed to in previous administrations, for lack of a better word, with chairs. It wasn't the topic of discussion, because land use and the rezoning and all the stuff that's been happening in the district. So with the concern of gentrification and some of these other items that are displacing people, I think it's very healthy for us to get ahead of that and to start analyzing properties, not only in the sense of preservation, but even to be ahead of the curve for land use development. And I think that this all ties in, so that when your new chair takes on land use, there'll be more work towards those efforts proactively as opposed to reactively. So outside of that update, I can take us to you do? Yeah, I mean, usually staff read that, but I can read it out. HPT anticipates a ULIP certification for the proposed Carmen Diegas apartments, which that's what we saw last year, in the end of the year. Project in early February 2025. So once they submit that, we'll get it. We'll have our 60-day review period, and then we'll take a position. So some of you look at the pre-ULIP that was done, and don't quote me whether it was November or December. I'm pretty certain it was December. Go back there, look at that presentation. The presentation is up on the website. Let's try to be as proactive as possible with Q&A. So then that way, when we're dealing with the development team, we're more focused on the technical aspirations of land use, as opposed to some of our advocacy concerns that we can also still deal with, but maybe not necessarily withhold our meeting hostage. That makes sense. Thank you for that, Jessica. So presentations and discussions, we're gonna go to Mr. George James. Happy New Year. For those who don't know, like, George James is our land use consultant and one of the pioneers of urban planning in our district.
Thank you. Okay, so if I can share my screen, I will.
So George, you've been declining my promotion to journalist. If you could just accept,
Okay.
you go. And
Sign away, George.
hold on one second. Let me just stop my share, and then you can go ahead, George. You should be able to
Okay.
share now.
Okay, I will. Share this. Okay. And Chair, the way I'm there are two agenda items. This kind of flows from one to another. We could stop it if there are questions after the first one.
Thank you, George.
Okay, let me do this. Okay, so last month, City of Yes for Housing Opportunity was approved by council. It passed with a vote of 30 to 21. All but the one of the Manhattan delegation of the council members voted yes. There were significant changes that were made to it by city council. They were made dozens of modifications. And they've summarized in this document, which we're not going to go through entirely today, but I'm going to highlight a few of the changes that they made so that you're all aware. So the NYCHA infill, you were just talking about NYCHA. The referred text had changed the zoning rules to permit substantial infill on NYCHA campuses. It was just the zoning change. It didn't do anything other than change the zoning rules. And we'd massed it out at Washington houses like this. Those rules are removed for NYCHA. They're gone. And for other places like Franklin Plaza, which is not NYCHA, the rules have been modified. And so they have been changed for private sites. But for NYCHA, they will not apply. Small units. The referred text that you all reviewed had this removed the dwelling unit factor, which prevented buildings with all studio apartments. This is an issue in East Harlem because what we're seeing in new developments is that developers have been building units as small as possible. They're generally bumping into the dwelling unit factor as they develop their units, and which suggests that they would go smaller if they would have been allowed. And so what happened is that City Council rolled that back in East Harlem. They actually kept it in place in the Manhattan core in community districts 1 through 8, but in East Harlem and Uptown, it's been rolled back and it's unchanged from what it is now. Parking. The referred text removed parking requirements citywide, and while council rolled it back in some places, they didn't change it in Community District 11. So East Harlem no longer has parking requirements in the zoning. The existing garages, they have to stay, but owners can get a CPC authorization to remove them if they want to. I think converting these to other uses are difficult. I don't think that's going to be a common thing, but they just can't get rid of existing parking. And then finally, I was going to talk a little bit about UAP and affordable housing. So the referred text had universal affordability preference, or UAP, which is this 20% increase in FAR for 20% affordable housing. This would apply everywhere outside the mandatory inclusionary housing areas. So the city council changed UAP so that at least 20% of the UAP units had to be at 40% of AMI, so dropping it down a little bit to reach the lower AMI levels, but it's still the same average 60% of AMI, still the same bonus, still the same number of units. It just reaches a little bit deeper. And you know, what UAP does is it provides an option for every development in East Harlem to have at least 20% affordable housing. Sorry. Since UAP is optional, there has been this concern that it may not be used, but UAP and 485X, which is the 421A replacement, the state subsidy, they can be used on the same projects. And so if you're doing a rental building, developers can effectively double dip both of the subsidies. And if they're going to be using 485X, they're almost certainly going to use UAP. So they can get, essentially take advantage of both subsidies. After the zoning was finalized last month, the rulemaking for 485X was completed. So now we have the zoning in place. Now we have 485 completely in place now. And so we will find out whether people use it. But actually, I'm pretty optimistic in places like East Harlem where there's a lot of rentals that are being built. There's issues with condominiums, but we don't see that many up here. Okay, so that's my summary of the City of Yes changes. And what I'm going to do now, unless there are questions, I'm going to go into how.
There are questions,
Yes,
George.
absolutely.
Thank you so much, George. I think I'm just having a hard time understanding because of like the rule was presented and then it was part of it and now it's removed. So I just want to make sure I have a full understanding. So
Sure.
for the first one, you said the NYCHA elements have just overall been removed entirely, so we don't have to worry about any development on NYCHA campuses. Just want to confirm that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can still develop NYCHA campuses, but the loosening of the rules that made it very easy to develop NYCHA campuses. That is essentially if you have to get what is it, Section 18 approval from HUD, these rules don't apply. And
Okay.
so they essentially revert back to our existing rules right now.
Okay, perfect. And then for the second one, the dwelling unit factor, that the allowance, I guess, to do only studio apartments was removed for Upper Manhattan / East Harlem.
That's right. You still have a dwelling unit factor here, just as you have now.
Perfect. And then for parking, as you noted, no change in East Harlem.
Well, right. So, yeah, right. It is exactly as the referred text in East Harlem. Yes.
Okay, perfect. And then for UIP, it's reaching deeper affordability levels, but it's the same overall average.
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Okay, you could go keep going up. Is there any questions raised on the Zoom chat?
Yeah,
Let's
there's a Jose Trucios.
let's acknowledge him. Jose, he's from DCD.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Hi, no, I just wanted to be promoted, but yeah, thank you, George, for clarifying. Those are all clear points. I'll be joining as a panelist now.
okay.
Thank you, Jose. George, you can continue. Thank you for the patience.
Okay. So the rest of this is going to talk about how affordable housing has changed in East Harlem in recent years. And that's important to understand where what the need is by looking at how we're doing in the recent past. And there are some great data sources that are available now to look at recent change. First, we're going to start with rent stabilized housing, and then we're going to get into new and preserved income restricted housing. Now, I've done versions of these in years past because, data changes and they need to be updated. So some of this may sound familiar, but it's been updated from the last time I did this, I think in 2021. All right, so most rental buildings with 6 or more units built before 1974 are or were subject to rent stabilization, right? So rent stabilization, most of you know, limits rent, requires lease renewals, among a number of other regulations. Units can be removed from rent stabilization. You may have heard one method was luxury decontrol, but that ended in 2019. New rent stabilized units are also added through new construction, or existing buildings opt into HPD programs that require rent stabilization. And while there is a list of buildings that are subject to rent stabilization, neither the city nor the state publishes the number of units in those buildings that are subject to rent stabilization. So that list is fairly meaningless because it could have 1 unit or the entire building could be in rent stabilization. And I also don't know how often it's updated. So the data aren't published on how many units in a building are in rent stabilization, but it's also not a secret. The buildings with rent stabilized units have to pay a tax on those units, which means the number of rent stabilized units appears on their tax bills, and tax bills are public. So the following summary here was taken from a tax bill for 158 East 97th Street. And you can see it has 11 rent stabilized units in 2024. And you can go through time and see how this building on East 97th Street lost units and then leveled out. It had 20 units at one point. Now it has 11 rent stabilized units for a loss of 45% of its rent stabilized units. Now, since the government doesn't publish this database of number of rent stabilized units, citizens took matters into their own hands. In 2015, a citizen hacker downloaded all the tax bills and scraped the number of rent stabilized units from the PDFs and made a database. This was first done for the period 2007 to 2014. And it was a very important part of the East Harlem neighborhood plan because it documented the need, the loss of units. In 2020, my office processed the data to essentially update the database from 2014. We had a database that went to 2020 for every building in Manhattan. More recently, Pratt and processed the data, and ANHD is distributing the data. And so let's look at it. So this right here is a result of, this shows you change in rent stabilized housing at the building level for the entire borough. Every point on this is a building with rent stabilized housing. The red, or at least one time had rent stabilized housing. The red show buildings that have losses. The blues show buildings that have gains. Greens are buildings with little change. And so when you look at this map, you know, at the borough level, you could see there's a enormous amount of red to the south and, you know, fair amount of green and a lot less red to the north. And what we can do with this data, because we have it at the individual level, is we could summarize it by any geography we want. And so what we've done is, for comparative purposes, is we've tried to summarize it by community district and then looking at increases versus decreases and a net change, all right? And so when we analyze the database, we see that on a net basis, Manhattan lost about 68,000 units of rent stabilized housing in that period. But that was, there's a bunch of gains. There's like an increase of about 50,000, but buildings that had rent stabilized units lost 117, 118,000 units. And when you look at it by community district, it is definitely not evenly distributed in Manhattan. The community district 4 saw the most net increase. Community district 11 saw an increase in rent stabilized units during that period, even though Manhattan showed 68,000 rent stabilized units lost. And that's because, you know, you have a lot of buildings in East Harlem like this. Built in 2003, it has 232 units, nearly all of them rent stabilized. And with buildings like this that just don't change very much at all. And then you also have new constructions or conversions, which go into 100% rent stabilized buildings, which offset losses, and in fact, you know, help to contribute to a net gain in the period. But one thing to remember, though, and this is very important, is that not all rent stabilized units are affordable, and in fact, DCP likes to say that they only look at income restricted housing as affordable housing. And a lot of rent stabilized units are not income restricted. And when I say income restricted, what does that mean? That means you got to go through a housing lottery with HPD, right? You got to have an application, you go in, they verify income and all of that, and then you get chosen only via a lottery. And then, so, okay, let's say, all right, let's look at just income restricted housing. income restricted housing can also be tracked over time, at least the new stuff, the stuff that's coming online right now, the new construction, and also what's been preserved. So open data since 2014, or at least has been distributing data going back to 2014, shows the number of income restricted housing units by development. And we can summarize those data. And for new construction, Community District 11 is second in Manhattan with 18% of the borough total. Community District 4 is again number 1. And then you have, 1 and 2, which are getting almost nothing. These are units that are preserved, meaning these are income restricted units which were in programs that were expiring that the city came in and re-upped into a new program. And those get counted again as preserved units. In this case, Community District 11 is with almost 11,000 units preserved in the period, has 22% of the borough total. And in fact, if you were to add up newly developed and preserved, Community District 11 is number 1 in Manhattan in the period of for preserved and developed affordable housing. You can also look at the depth of affordable housing and other measures as well. There's a lot of detail in here, and you will find that Community District 11 also reaches into the lower levels of affordability much more than Community District 4, which is the other that gets a lot. All right, so there are some questions of why Community District 11 performs better than most other community districts. Well, there's a combination of things. There's many fewer losses in the older pre-war buildings. I've spent a lot of time in Community District 8 and 7 and 2, and they're just hemorrhaging units out of these older pre-war buildings. And you just don't see that kind of loss in East Harlem. There's also the new construction of rent-stabilized units. Most new construction has rent-stabilized units, especially in the larger buildings. Other community districts have much more 100% market rates. Community District 11 also has publicly owned sites where the city can and does require 100% affordable rent-stabilized housing. They don't do this in other community districts. This is something that I'm learning firsthand, is that there's a lot of times the city has city-owned property and they EDC does something with it, and they have some mixed income, and there's even a property in Community District 1 that they just disposed of, which I was just very shocked to see. So this policy of 100% affordable housing on publicly owned site is an East Harlem thing. It's not a citywide thing. City-sponsored rezonings in the community district require or incentivize affordable and rent-stabilized housing. And then there's, of course, the city investment, right? So HPD they invest in affordable housing, and they preserve and produce substantial amounts of rent-stabilized and income-restricted housing, right? This is the East Harlem Housing Plan, which is directing a lot of this investment. This is from 2018. It was the the offspring of the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan. And, in short, when I see this, the community-led plan, city-led implementation, focusing on affordability is producing results you all plan for. So yes, East Harlem is doing well, and it's not all associated with the plan, the neighborhood plan and the housing plan, but a lot of it is. And as a planner, it's always nice to see when things are coming out as you planned. And we know that the East Harlem neighborhood plan is not perfect, but there is there are a lot, some commitments that haven't been made, but a lot of them have been, and the data bear it out. That's all I have. I have a lot of other stuff in here on data limitations and more on the if you want to use the data, where to get it from, you can download it. We put it out on a website. It doesn't have to be me. It's all freely available. And if you want to play with it, or you have students or others who are interested in this topic, they can just go and get it. That's it.
That was an excellent presentation, George. You further advised us how much our time is valued as community board members. And I say that seriously because you heard from your urban planner, our land use consultant of the district, that our advocacy and, for lack of a better word, borderline protesting has further developed and created affordable housing in comparison to other districts. Like if you look at District 1, that's the southern tip of Manhattan. You look at District 4 that he brought up, that's Lincoln Center and the infamous San Juan Hill that got redeveloped over, that displaced a multitude of Puerto Ricans so many years ago. So to hear that Community District 11 is still managing and maintaining for its existing constituents is at least for me, I think is very savory for our efforts and should be motivating to continue with such. So, Adele?
Yeah, one thing I find a little concerning, I guess, is the city requiring 100% affordability, but not in all districts and just in ours. I mean, part of me thinks that that's because they don't want to use like Community District 1, more valuable land or whatever, but it just sounds like while you're creating affordability, you're concentrating it all in the same places it's always been concentrated. And you're not building affordable housing in other neighborhoods where it's almost coming off like you want to keep certain groups and certain people out of there. So I mean, that's another way to look at it. Like, it's great that we're doing it here, but why is that rule different here? I mean.
I listen, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I would say this is that when they do residential developments, it always has some affordable housing in it. They don't just, if it's residential, it's going to have, either a minimum of MIH or maybe 50%, 50-50, something like that. But why isn't it 100%? I mean, if the major impediment to affordable housing in New York City is the cost of land, and the land is already publicly owned, and you only get one shot at it, then why don't you use it for affordable housing, right? I mean, if that's your priority, that's what you should be doing. And they're doing that in East Harlem, right? Let's be very clear. They are doing that in East Harlem, but it's not being done in other community districts.
And before we push that, George, if it's possible, could you give me some of these talking points that you made relevant to this? Because what I'm going to be inclined to do is to bring this up at executive and have our board chair ask all the other chairs in borough board as to that question, right, publicly. So that way, maybe a conversation and
absolutely. Absolutely. And I see Jose wants to say something.
Yeah, give me a second, Jose. I got to acknowledge members first.
Oh, sure.
I'm sorry, it was a Ken or Vinny who had their head up. Yeah, Vinny.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you, Joe, for that. Just two questions. On the, do you know, in putting the day together, East Harlem has put out more affordable housing. Most of it, or some of it, or a good portion of it was through all the development. And the land disposition and conveyance for public land versus those throughout other districts. So we've raised more units, but we've probably given out more land. There's been
indeed.
more, right? So do you have that data? Is one question that I'm asking versus districts versus other districts as it relates to the land that was dispositioned and conveyed. And then also on the rent stabilization, the IR, the income restricted units, what's the percentage of IR against the RS, another one, what's the percentages of, income restricted? Units on all of the rent stabilized units, 20%, 30%, lower.
Yeah, we could calculate that. It's the so for the new rents, the new income restricted are relatively small numbers, right? There were some between 2,000 and 3,000 in East Harlem. For existing, that was a much bigger number, more like 10,000. Now there are more rent stabilized units than that in East Harlem, but it's a substantially larger number. But it's not like, maybe it's like 50%, something like that. We can calculate it, Vinny. I just haven't done that. And I also haven't done your other question looking at, the land, right? Where, what's being disposed of, what's the disposition, and which of these are resulting from public land and non-public land. This is just a summary of those data, but we have the individual records, so we could actually dig into that.
Thank you, George.
Beverly?
Happy New Year again, George. Great presentation. Do you know whether or not our increase of housing and affordability housing is more so because of the land that the city owned is being given to nonprofit organizations as opposed to profit organizations? Would that be a factor as to why we're doing so well here?
Well, I mean, that's a contributing factor, is that East Harlem has public land that the city is using for housing. And a lot of community districts just don't have very much, right? Or if they have it, it's being used for schools and things like that, right? And so East Harlem had more public land that it's using for that. But it's a combination of factors. It's not just that one thing.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, George. If you'd like to close.
Oh yeah, no, this is, oh, sorry.
No, it's not, it's so hard to see the virtual people, and honestly, moving forward, and it ain't gonna just be Jose. Any administrative agency that's getting a government check, you should be in person. But I'll make that claim at full board and at executive. It's nothing against you, Jose, it's just all of the city agents.
It does make sense. I also had CB, 9 and 12, but tomorrow I'll be in Harlem. I just wanted to, kind of like not respond, but kind of elaborate on a couple of things that George was saying, which is, I think the concentration of affordable housing also goes back to like the cost of building, something that we had heard before. And George, I think you were referring to 7 North Moore, the small lot that was disposed by the city on Community District 1. I think we had asked, and I think this came out in the CPC conversation about like, why are we not doing something in there in terms of housing? And, I think when we asked those questions, that's part of like HPDs, or I believe in this case was DCNY, who was the owner of that site.
Mm-hmm.
That costs for development offset potentially the maintenance of the property. So those things are like outside our purview in terms of the land use, but they look into what subsidies could potentially be in there, how many properties could be developed, and a lot of these things also for other community boards outside CB10 and CB4 also, that I think most of that development comes from some areas that had inclusionary housing designated areas,
Mm-hmm.
non-mandatory inclusionary housing areas, some areas in Jackson Yards. But East Harlem has the most mandatory inclusionary housing areas, mandating income restricted housing. And a lot of those things have been citing in other community board zoning. So through the City of Yes, that's one of those things that we wanted to do, facilitate the development, make it a little bit easier for lots that could potentially be developed in the future. In 7 or more, we also look closely into it with City of Yes, and even with the removal of the sliver law and all those things, he could only, I think, develop 6 to 10 units of housing in it. So, it wasn't something that HPD or any other agency could potentially take as a financial feasible development. So there are restrictions on that. But we hope to see more things coming on board. As you know, also the mayor had just recently announced the Manhattan Plan, and as well as City of Yes for families. And I don't have much details. That plan was announced, I believe on Thursday, and we find out on Wednesday. I know the leadership is meeting with City Hall. There is an ongoing task force that's being created for this, for City of Yes, and also for the Manhattan Plan. They're going to start working on this, and as we get more details, we'll start briefing the community board to engage and use some of the resolutions that were passed for City of Yes. And I think it's also a response to a lot of the concerns that we hear about the dwelling unit factor and the reduction of family units and new development. And I don't know, what particularly will be proposed in City of Yes for family, but if anything, I can guess from the name will be something a little more in terms of the unit mix and being proposed, but we'll be in touch on those things. And
Chair,
that's
can I
every-
ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So you said that there's a task force that's being formed to discuss the Manhattan Plan and the City for Families. And so who's on that task force? How do you get on that task force?
I think that is being developed. What I mean by the task force is like it's being created right now, and I think they're
Jose,
gonna
I
start doing.
volunteer.
Yeah, I know. We have said that before in the past.
I've
I think,
said it many times.
yeah,
I
and we
volunteer
passed.
for all of these things. I just
Yeah.
wait for the invitation.
I know. Yeah, definitely. I know. As you know, I also keep you always on my emails and the things that send the community boards and everybody. But I believe if anything, John Mangian again will be leading, or the housing division will be leading this. That is part of the conversation that's happening right now in City Hall. If it's going to be something that HPD will lead, DCP, we still don't know. There are a lot of things to fix, but the plan is in there, so it will happen. But again, I want to assure the community board that this is not something that is just going to be created within this task force. It will essentially pull information and data that we have already gathered from the past, similar to what we did with housing opportunity, right? So like pulling the where we live data, and I think for this part it's going to be critical to keep an eye on a lot of the resolutions that I got. If I can be honest with you, like a lot of the things that we passed, not just in Upper Manhattan, but also in other community boards, were particularly highly concerned about the unit mix as being essentially perceived as being reduced, and how housing opportunity wasn't doing much about that. So this would, I believe, is a response to that. But
Right.
soon come.
Okay.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, George. If there's no other question or comments, George, you could close or we can move on.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George.
Bye.
All right. And our last order of business, old business, we are going to, a lot of you are aware, we've had Maggie's Garden back at Fort Pierce since pretty much September of 2024. We were trying to strategize on various ways within our capacity as advocates to this constituent as to pointing them into the right direction for preservation of their garden. We heard a mirage of ways to do this, and in our capacity of just a land use landmarks preservation committee, we pretty much just advise them to start the process of submitting with the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So that being said, today's order of business is going to provide them a letter of support in that effort so that they can submit their application. It doesn't mean there's going to be a reapproval, a rejection, or an idealization. The more interest is for them to get started in the process. And those of us that have been a part of it, which I'm pretty much going to notify our chair from Parks, that we should be tracking this for a lot of reasons, right? More importantly, so we have the know-how and we can advise future constituents, not necessarily just for the park, but again, even for buildings, community board, community-based organizations, both private and nonprofit, and even public, right? Because sometimes, believe it or not, our office here is questioned of whether or not we're going to renew our lease. Right, so there's the little, you know, again, there's a big molehill, and again, I would love to, again, just once more. Congratulate Jessica Moore for initiating the effort and Kendra Crouch for seeing it through and pretty much bringing us to the position where this committee, since I've been chairing it, is now gonna have its opportunity to do its first action as it relates to landmarks and preservation in the district. So that's the 411. You've been sent all the meeting, the materials justifying their request for a letter of support from the various elected officials, other local nonprofits within the organization, within the district that support their efforts. They've been here month to month. I'm always open for questions, comments, and after questions, comments, I'll then hear for a motion. So that being said, is there any questions?
Just brief comments, they did send their regards, not able to make it tonight because they're working with the Historic District Council. On, what you just talked with Jason, landmarks processing, and so again, they send their regards, they're working really hard, we've seen the letters of support they have, and I just want to echo that, and we're appreciative of what they're doing here, and we're happy to support it if we can.
Question?
Oh, yeah, I saw the list of, other letters that have been provided, it's pretty extensive, so that's great, I think it'll hopefully be a successful application, but I would just say before, we can do what we will as a committee to approve or whatever we're gonna do here, but if we do a letter, if we could just, make sure that we have a draft before full board, so we can.
Luckily, as you know,
That'd be helpful.
in various capacities, the board has a generic.
Yeah.
Letter of support. We're not gonna, I'm gonna die for Maggie's garden. It gets deep. I get it for some of us, but for most of us, we have to be bipartisan and applicable. So the letter of support is just supporting their efforts. We're not making any commitments, no claims, no covenants, no contracts.
Ready to make a motion.
So I hope that clears it up. I have to emphasize that caveat because we may get a halt on that, but I promise you, just like with our resolutions, we have a template for letters of support. So any other questions? Concerns, comments? Anything I'll raise? Excellent. I'll take a motion. Motion by Vinnie to.
The support.
Issue a letter of support. For Landmarks Preservation Commission to evaluate Maggie's Magical Garden for designation as a scenic landmark. Do I hear a second? Second by Jessica. All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Any present not voting? The vote passes unanimously. Thank you. Congratulations. First letter of support in the world of preservation. So that being said, I'll move on the agenda. Is there any new business?
Oh, I had possibly an old business item.
Yeah.
So we had spoken at one of our first meetings around like our goals for the upcoming year. I know something that we've talked about is like a vacancy tax, like trying to do things to incentivize not having units be warehoused. And so in the past month, I learned about something that you may already know about called the land value tax, right? And so it's something that is legal in Pennsylvania. There are 15 cities that use a land value tax, and broadly, the idea is it is the land that is taxed, not any improvements on the land. And so if you are the landowner and you don't make improvements on it, the idea is the taxes are so high that if you're not improving the land, it's not worth it for you to sit on it. And just hope that the increase in value over time sort of covers the property taxes you're paying on your vacant land or underutilized land. So it is something that was considered at the New York State level. There was a Senate bill in 2023, S7871A. S7871A. It didn't really go anywhere. It was basically to allow it to be a possibility. It'd be piloted in like 5 municipalities. The same state senator has put it forward in this legislative term. Way, I was just looking it up. And then this term, it's S1131.
No way.
So I thought it would be something connected to a thing we had talked about. I think we could go learn more about it. You know, some of the obstacles to switching to a land value tax is like, how do you do it? Right? How do you then sort of reassess everything? It's a lot easier in today's day and age. You saw that data George was talking about, like there's just a lot easier to sort of crunch the numbers. And the idea almost is like, you know what your total tax burden is, you're just going to reallocate it across the properties. So there would be people whose property taxes like would go down as a result of a land value tax. I thought it was something that I'd share with all of you. So I hope we can perhaps learn more about it. It's something that's not new. It was proposed like 150 years ago. There was a guy running for the mayor of New York City who that was his big thing. It's actually his last name is George, so it's called Georgism, funny enough. So I encourage you to learn more about it and perhaps another
Could
conversation.
you, if you have time, could you like text me the link and?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for
I
sure.
definitely would love to get that info to housing as well.
Yeah.
Though we do have the chair here.
Yeah.
Needless to say, it's always in the interest of the board to try to be proactive with advocacy. I need not say, it might not necessarily fall in our purview, which I don't, but it doesn't take away from, you know, you being proactive, and I know I appreciate the information.
Learning new things.
I can't wait to read the bill that this
Yeah.
senator is proposing and seeing if there's gonna be any fluff for it in the city.
Cuomo talked about it in like 93.
Yeah.
That's like doing it. So I know it's got a long history, which is kind of pretty interesting.
I was
Yeah,
7
almost
years
that,
old.
exactly. Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
I was a baby. Yes, Justin.
I just have two little points on that. One is like, do we feel any value to like, if we look at this, that we might wanna make like a resolution or a motion at a future meeting to be in support if we should.
I think,
choose.
yeah, I think something to learn is like, I don't know what the state of this in like New York City is.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure the state senator is like an upstate senator. I don't believe that they're a New York City one. So I don't know if it's even on like the radar. That's something I'm hoping to learn more about, is if there are people in New York City like that are interested in this, even know what it is. So maybe the first step would be, once we decide if this is a thing we think is worth it, just sort of engaging people on it is where I think it's at.
And then the second question I had was just that I know we have the intern here that's doing
Yes,
the like sort of assessment of
yes.
that information.
Well, I only spoke with him once. I was trying to help him out with some data
Yeah,
maybe 2 weeks ago. And we were at least trying to determine the number of, I think, maybe vacant units.
Yeah.
And maybe trying to acquire a sample of the buildings in this district and just provide or substantiate some data to make a case for the vacancy units, maybe along the commercial sectors or whatever type of geographic portions in this district. So that's a better question for Angel.
Yeah.
But definitely, you're trying to gather data. I don't know his name.
Yeah, and an advantage of a land value tax, like you can't hide the property.
Right.
Right, it's public record who owns it, whereas like a concern with the vacancy tax, you're like, well, how do you know? How do we prove that this apartment is vacant? Like the enforcement mechanism would be so hard that it would kind of interfere with it probably working, whereas like land is a fixed quantity. There's so much of it in the city. It's known who owns it, how it changes hands. And it would just be once you calculate the values, it then becomes very, very easy to administer over time. And then as land is bought and sold, that sort of resets what the expectation is around the value of that land. So it's very interesting. Economists call it the perfect tax. I don't know if that's true. And last thing I'll put out there is what it's coupled with, and what this guy George, who ran for mayor of New York, said was that like you would get rid of all other taxes, right? So like you wouldn't need income tax Because again, it's like, right, like, because an economist would say, when you tax something, less of it is produced. Right, and so you can't produce less land, it's a fixed amount, so a tax on it wouldn't stop people from making more of it, so it's very interesting. I encourage you, like I said, to learn some more about it. I'm certainly no expert, but it was a fun thing reading about this and learning more.
I find it interesting before I call on Beverly, and I would say like as a committee, it's a project. It's something that's no different than what we just went through with landmarks preservation. We could do the same thing as it relates to land use tax, because needless to say, housing is busy day to day dealing with actual issues of today, where this is more of a advocacy legislative effort that we could make and get it to a point. There's a few ways to tackle it. I'll say off the back, something where, you know, we don't need everyone's approval is the statement of district needs. Right, that's always an opportunity. And then second to that, I don't disagree with the vice chair's conception of a resolution, right? But I am always pro fact, pro check the boxes when we do resolutions, because I've sat on the other side where that resolution comes across that elected official, oh, okay. And it goes right in the trash, right? Unfortunately, and it's not, you know, they'll say they read it, but I've been told right to my face by council members that, oh, you did that. That's great. We never got it. When in fact, then staff shows me that they provided to them. So I say like to say this, it definitely has traction. There's a lot of interest in it. Not necessarily just from this community board, but if we put something really good together, you know, amongst the other things, is as you heard in February, we're gonna take our land use action on, and we're gonna have 60 days of dealing with those projects while we're still managing everything that we're doing. Again, not to take away, but Ken, if you don't mind, when we do the minutes, we'll just carry in old business like we did with Maggie's Garden, and we'll chat about it every month.
Sure.
Everybody try to do their homework, their best due diligence. Here's the deal though. We don't have a direct plane in sight or a way to, as our chair would say, land the jet, then we'll abandon the effort for now, right? Whether, and maybe reconvene on that next year, if that makes sense. So, because like, that's what happened with Maggie's Garden. We had to take a position, because if not, they'd be here every month for the next 2 years. Right, so,
Sure.
and in fairness to all, to everyone's time, right? If that makes sense. So I'm sorry, Beverly.
My question was that most of the time when they have these land taxes, usually just going against private ownership. Cities have their own land, things that they have warehouse for decades and stuff like that, so I would definitely like to see that everybody, I mean, I don't care who owns the land, city or private, that is addressed.
Exactly, yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Is there any other old business, new business? I hear none.
I just want
Oh,
to make a
yeah.
point that it seems like all the changes George went through for the city of Yes were pretty relatively positive for our district, so I feel pretty good about that.
I don't disagree, but I'm very committed. I know who our council is.
Yeah.
And they're, you know, if it was 5 to 10 years ago, I'd be having a different position, but knowing how diverse the council is. And I'll say that again, knowing how diverse our council is, I'm pretty certain the voices that are there spoke to the reason of our constituents that are in this district, which is fortunate. Might not be the case in 5 to 10 years, so let's keep it while it's hot, right? You never know. There's a lot of seats up in next year, in Bronx, Manhattan, every borough, literally half the council is gonna get flooded, so I'm interested to see where that lies. Where this council is predominantly female, believe it or not, there's a lot of women in the city council, so you know, it's worked in our favor. Anyone else, anything else? No, all right, roll call, Mr. Khalid, please.
Okay, you got it. Sorry. Adam Crouch, go ahead. Jessica Elliott. Arnice Foster Hernandez.
Present.
Absent. Absent. Jessica Morris.
I'm present.
Oso Rama.
Present.
Beverly Pavone.
Present.
Derek Samplone.
Present.
Vinnie Torres.
Present.
Citizen Villanueva.
Present.
Candy Vives Vasquez.
Present.
Excellent. That being said, I will call the meeting to adjournment at 7:35 if there's no objections.
Great job, 1 hour.
That's awesome. That's a record for me. Let's keep it.
Local record.
Night, says you go. Oh, yeah, on the record, man. Off the record. It was going away.